January 1916. The war entered its second year. With the new year, Germany's strategic position across all fronts appeared stable. Throughout 1915, the Kaiser's armies had driven deep into Russian territory and seemingly shattered the Tsar's ability to launch any meaningful counteroffensive. Serbia, meanwhile, had suffered an even heavier defeat at the hands of a combined German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian force. The Central Powers overran the small nation that had ignited the conflict, pushing the remnants of the Serbian army off the European mainland. Serbia's collapse reopened rail links with Turkey, reinforcing that embattled ally. On both the Italian front and in France, the Central Powers had withstood a succession of determined Entente offensives and appeared capable of repelling further assaults for the time being. Yet, despite encouraging reports on every front, German General Staff Chief Erich von Falkenhayn remained no closer to fulfilling the objectives he had laid out back in November 1914. Russia had endured devastating losses in the summer of 1915, but the Tsar still rejected Berlin's proposals for a separate peace. In the West, Falkenhayn had failed to mount an offensive that might split the Entente and drive France out of the war. As a result, Germany was obliged to keep large forces committed on both fronts, unable to amass the strength needed to crush a single opponent in a decisive campaign. For all the stability of the situation, both Falkenhayn and the Austrian Chief of Staff, Count Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, agreed the war would have to be brought to an end by 1917. The two general staff chiefs saw that their nations would soon reach the end of their resources. Falkenhayn believed that the military means would have to be found to entice one of the Entente powers into a separate peace with Germany. That opportunity was to be found only on the Western Front. There, the German army would take the offensive for the first time since 1914 in an all-or-nothing gamble to force an end to the war. Although several powerful Entente offensives had dented the German lines in the West during the course of 1915, the German position remained largely unchanged since the end of 1914. The Western Front still consisted of a trench system that ran unbroken from just south of Ostend in the north to Fetterhausen on the Swiss border. Behind their respective trench works, 119 German divisions faced 96 French and 43 British divisions. Additionally, each side could draw upon significant reserves. By mid-January 1916, the Germans maintained a reserve of 25 divisions in the west, while the French reserve consisted of 24 divisions, and the British of 36. Thus, the Germans faced a numerically superior foe in the West, a strong French army with generally good reserves, and a British army which had not yet reached its peak strength. Offsetting the material factors were morale and training. Early in 1915, Falkenhayn judged the French army to be deficient in both these categories, and the British to be undertrained in their rush to get troops to the front. In September, Falkenhayn told the Kaiser that the French are at the end of their strength and in no condition to attack. The utter failure of the French offensive in 1915 only served to reinforce his low estimate of the French and his high confidence in the German soldier. The British soldiers, on the other hand, were seen to have a great deal of confidence in themselves and in their commanders. The German intelligence branch believed that Britain's pre-war professional army had been largely wiped out by late 1915. Yet it had supplied the cadres needed to create the backbone of several fresh divisions. Their assessment concluded that by the end of 1915, the British army remained a formidable opponent, while the French army was nearing exhaustion. These judgments would go on to shape German strategy in 1916. At the close of 1915, Falkenhayn faced a difficult strategic dilemma. While he assumed Russia was incapable of major offensive operations in the near future, the Eastern Giant had not been forced out of the war. Germany still had to keep considerable forces in the east to guard against any limited Russian moves. In the west, Falkenhayn could muster only 26 divisions in reserve. Across no man's land, he confronted two enemies, each with deep reserves and heavily fortified trench systems. The chief of the Imperial General Staff now faced the challenge of deciding where and in what manner to launch an offensive with the limited means available in 1916. Falkenhayn regarded the British Expeditionary Force as Germany's principal foe, yet he judged Britain to be the hardest adversary to bring down. In his view, the British held the strongest defensive sector on the Western Front, with the heaviest concentration of troops, and this could not be breached with the forces Germany had at hand. He also reasoned that even if Britain's army suffered a crushing setback, it would not be enough to drive the nation out of the conflict. Nevertheless, Falkenhayn believed that in 1916, Germany might still persuade Britain that victory was impossible. To achieve this, he intended to sever the island's sea lifeline through the launch of unrestricted submarine warfare. As he aimed a heavy blow at Britain's lifeline, Falkenhayn also sought to knock away England's sharpest weapon by striking France and breaking the French army's will to fight. On December 3rd, he reported to the Kaiser on preparations for the coming year. Generaloberst Hans von Plessen noted the meeting in his diary. General von Falkenhayn rolled out for His Majesty a serious picture of the situation, with the conclusion that to carry the war to its end, an attack in the west, where all available strength has already been collected, should be attempted. It is to be then that the Entente will attack us in the west, and thereby bleed themselves white. Although his plan lacked full clarity in early December, Plessen's entry reveals that Falkenhayn had already devised the concept. The French must be lured into attacking German positions, hurling wave after wave into a prepared killing ground. His intention was to attack the French at a single point where they would have no choice but to launch an immediate counterstroke. That target was the fortress city of Verdun, a powerful emblem of French pride. In 1914, before the Marne, it had held firm against repeated German blows. Had it fallen, Paris, and perhaps the war itself, might have been lost. Verdun was the hinge of the entire Allied line. At first sight, its defenses appeared daunting, encircled by ridges on both sides of the Meuse and shielded by a network of fortifications, 20 major forts and 40 smaller ones. Foremost among them was Fort Douaumont, dominating the landscape from a 200-foot height northeast of the city. Yet this apparent strength was deceptive. French headquarters had stripped many of the forts of their guns to reinforce the great autumn offensives of the previous year. By 1916, more than 200 guns had been stripped from Verdun's defenses. On December 8th, Falkenhayn held an extended discussion with Generals Tappan and Wild regarding a possible assault on the forts surrounding the city. Such an operation offered several advantages. To begin with, the region was well served by railways, which could be further strengthened with spur lines to move supplies, and heavy railway artillery directly to the front. Secondly, Verdun itself jutted out in a salient, one that German artillery could dominate from multiple angles. Generalleutnant Adolf Wild von Hohenborn noted in his diary the benefits this would provide. During the attack from the north and the east, the French positions will soon be so diminished that not even a mouse can live in them. Most importantly, Verdun was an object for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have. The offensive was assigned to the German Fifth Army, commanded by Crown Prince Wilhelm, heir to the throne, thus ensuring the Kaiser's approval. In practice, however, the prince's chief of staff, General Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, directed the tactical planning. The opening stage of the operation was codenamed Gericht, Judgment. Falkenhayn's order to the Fifth Army was simply to launch an offensive towards Verdun. Notably, the directive made no mention of capturing the city itself, but Crown Prince Wilhelm envisioned something different, i.e., the objective is to capture the fortress of Verdun by precipitous methods. This divergence in interpretation would prove costly for Germany. Several conditions were vital to the scheme's success. First, the Germans needed to maintain ample reserves to repel the anticipated French relief attack. Second, they had to hold back sufficient forces to counterattack once the French had exhausted themselves in their attempts to save Verdun. Ultimately, Falkenhayn's entire design for 1916 depended on the enemy behaving exactly as he intended. For the opening assault, 140,000 infantrymen were gathered. Entire villages were cleared to accommodate them. In utmost secrecy, the German command concentrated more than 1,230 artillery pieces behind the lines: siege guns, naval guns, rapid-firing batteries, field pieces, and heavy mortars. These were the weapons meant to bleed France white. To keep this vast force supplied, the Quartermaster General of the Imperial Staff organized 1,300 munitions trains. In a ceaseless flow, they carried some 2.5 million shells. The buildup continued around the clock, hidden from French eyes. Across the lines, however, concerns about Verdun's defenses were already reaching French general headquarters at Chantilly. War Minister Joseph Gallieni warned the French commander-in-chief. "Reports have come to me indicating that in the Verdun region, the line of trenches appears not to have been completed. Should the enemy break through, not only would your responsibility be involved, but also that of the entire government." Joffre's reply was curt. "Nothing justifies the fears which you express in your dispatch." Meanwhile, German aircraft patrolled aggressively over the forward sector, hunting down any French reconnaissance plane that dared cross the front. The Imperial Air Service enjoyed undisputed mastery of the skies. They had brought together the largest concentration of air power yet seen in the war: 168 aircraft over Verdun, supported by a swarm of observation balloons. At last, even Joffre began to feel uneasy. Our minister to Denmark telegraphed that a German offensive was being talked about. This was immediately confirmed by news from Switzerland of the concentration of 400,000 men in the region of Verdun. A regiment of engineers was immediately sent to Verdun to strengthen the defenses on the east bank. With every tick of the clock, time was running out for the poorly prepared and outmanned French. German troops continued to pour into their forward trenches, the starting point for the grand offenses. By the thousands they came, the best troops in the German army, veterans hardened by 2 years of trench warfare. 24 hours before D-Day, all was ready. The troops now only had to wait for Judgment Day. Germanic efficiency had accounted for every eventuality, everything but the weather. Gales, rain, and blizzards forced Falkenhayn to delay the assault, scheduled to start on the 12th of February for 9 days. 9 days of trying to hide 1 million battle-ready men, the massed artillery, and mountains of ordnance from air reconnaissance. To hide from French patrols and pray that talkative deserters did not give the plan away. Nine critical days for the French to bring in 2 more divisions of veterans in hopes of stemming the German storm about to break on Verdun. The battle opened at dawn on the 21st of February. 21 miles behind the German lines, a single Krupp 38-centimeter naval gun fired the first round at a bridge spanning the Meuse. The shell missed its target, but it was the signal for the massed German artillery to unleash an unprecedented 9-hour bombardment. 1 heavy battery for every yard of trench, 1,000 guns in all. It is a war of brute material. For hours on end, you bombard them with 210s, 305s, and 380s. And when everything appears dead, when there's no more wire, no more trenches, and when the survivors have been reduced to a state of madness, they send the masses out to attack. When the French are on the receiving end, not one of them breaks through. If there's only 10 out of 100 left, these 10 will fight on. Letter from a French soldier in the line, February 21st, 1916. In the Bois des Cours alone, more than 80,000 shells rained down. The Boche started to bombard us with large-caliber shells for 10 hours. It was enough to drive you mad. We were buried alive, my entire squad, but miraculously all 7 of us emerged without a scratch. Now the 5 unlucky ones who came and took refuge with us in our dugout. 2 were killed and 3 were wounded. A soldier of the 311th Infantry Regiment, February 21st, 1916. With their communications to the rear cut off, the stunned French defenders were in no condition to resist a major blow. There and there in the front line were a few men who by chance had escaped. In all our minds, we had the same thought, but everyone to right and left had been killed. Awaiting his turn to advance, a young Hessian jotted down a final note to his mother. There's going to be a battle here the likes of which the world has never seen. Then came the order. Over the top! Elements of the German army pressed forward across a shattered, moon-like battlefield of barbed wire and concrete defenses, with 8 miles still between them and their objective. They moved slowly, not in a straight line, as though they were picking their way. Nothing could have looked less like an assault. Some of the Germans had containers strapped to their backs. They seemed like laborers going to spray the vines. Those laborers carried flamethrowers, Germany's new weapon, unleashed against the French for the first time. Tons of oil, forced out by compressed nitrogen, turned men into living torches. Yet German caution blunted the effect. Orders from above restricted infantry action on the opening day to small fighting patrols, probing for weak points through infiltration. Only one commander, General Hans von Zwehl of the 7th Reserve Corps, ignored those limitations, and in doing so, revealed what might have been achieved. Stormtroopers were placed just behind the leading patrols, and within 5 hours, the Bois d'Ormont was in German hands. In the Bois des Cours, however, Émile Driant's clever reliance on strong points rather than a continuous trench line allowed the surviving chasseurs to stubbornly resist the German 18th Corps. On February 22nd, von Zwehl again drove the German attack forward, smashing through a regiment of territorials from the French 72nd Division's left flank at the Bois de Consenvoye, then capturing Ormont and ripping open a gap in the French first line, exposing the flank of the Bois des Cours. That afternoon, the gallant Driant was killed while leading the remnants of his battalions toward the relative safety of Fort Beaumont. Within 2 hours, much of the French forward line had collapsed, but the Germans too were paying dearly, suffering severe casualties among their elite stormtroopers, losses they could not easily replace. The following day, the attackers encountered a hastily constructed intermediate line, so new it did not even appear on their maps. The stubborn defense of Herbebois by the French 51st Division finally ended by nightfall, though overall German gains were still short of expectations. Meanwhile, powerful French artillery was massing ominously on the left bank of the Meuse, offering little immediate relief to the hard-pressed infantry. Before dawn the next day, Samogneau fell to the Germans. The battered 51st and 72nd Divisions were nearing complete collapse. Fort Beaumont was lost, and within 3 hours the 2nd French defensive line disintegrated. The 3rd Zouave, thrown into the fight in fragments, without shelter from the freezing cold or the relentless bombardment, disintegrated under assault by the Brandenburgers. For the first time on the Western Front since 1914, German commanders believed a breakthrough was within their grasp. Few trenches now barred their way, hardly any wire at all. See, they give one the impression of complete breakdown and complain loudly of their senior commanders. The Kaiser himself came up to the front to watch the kill. By nightfall on the 24th, only the forts and a few brave men stood in the Germans' way. The pivotal point in the defense of Verdun, Fort Douaumont, was now uncovered. On the 25th of February, the men of the elite 24th Brandenburg Regiment entered the gap left by the retreating 3rd Zouaves. They had no orders to capture Fort Douaumont. The objective lay short of the fort, but their regimental motto was, "Do more than your duty." In small groups, they pushed beyond the stipulated objectives as far as Fort Douaumont. Emboldened by the curious inactivity of the fort, a few pioneers under a sergeant named Kuntze pressed through the outer defenses to the dry moat. Still undetected, they climbed through a gun embrasure in one of the fort's galleries. Inside the fort, the garrison numbered less than 60 overaged and undertrained territorial reservists commanded by a sergeant major. A handful of men were manning the guns. Though German 42-centimeter shells had not inflicted critical damage on the fort, the shock waves and fumes they produced had driven the majority of the defenders to shelter in the bowels of the concrete bastion. It's an unending hell. I live in the casemate at the bottom of the fort, with a light on day and night. You can't go out for fear of shell fragments, which fall daily into the trenches and onto the fort. In a word, it is solitude in all its horror. When will this veritable martyrdom end? letter discovered on the body of an unknown French soldier. Kunze was followed in by 3 other assault teams. Without a fight, the defenders of Fort Douaumont, the world's most powerful fortification, surrendered. The capture of such a prize at minimal cost ignited celebrations across Germany. The Crown Prince himself decorated the victorious Brandenburgers, and it seemed the road into Verdun, just 5 miles away, had been opened. Inside the city, panic spread. Whispers circulated. The city is lost. At French headquarters, opinions clashed. General Langle de Carie, commander of the Central Army Group, urged an immediate withdrawal of all remaining forces to the eastern heights. But the resolute de Castelnau opposed any retreat. He ensured General Henri-Philippe Pétain's Second Army would be pulled from reserve to defend the left bank of the Meuse, and extended Pétain's command to the right bank as well, which was to be held at all cost. Pétain's rise was remarkable. A peasant-born colonel nearing retirement when the war began, he was now summoned as the savior of France. Soldiers knew of him, his reputation for caring about their welfare, and his refusal to waste men's lives preceded him. Though he would have preferred to pull back to a stronger position, Pétain understood the realities of modern firepower and commanded trust. He instructed his officers to conserve strength for the counteroffensive that lay ahead. His arrival at Verdun transformed morale. Confidence in the fortress line was renewed. French artillery was massed to grind down the enemy, and Pétain placed supreme emphasis on logistics. With all major rail links destroyed by German long-range guns, only a single narrow-gauge line remained to supply the city. Alongside the railway ran one second-class road. It was only 20 feet wide, just wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. Pétain worked tirelessly to keep supplies moving along the only reliable route to the south, a road a French writer had christened La Voie Sacrée, or Sacred Way. Over 3,000 trucks, seized from across France and running on solid rubber tires, rattled ceaselessly along this road. The flow of traffic seemed endless. During the crucial week of February 25th, thousands of tons of supplies and 190,000 soldiers were funneled down this single artery. 6,000 vehicles each day, one every 14 seconds, continuing without pause for hours on end. In the months that followed, 2/3 of the French army would travel this route, bound for Verdun's slaughter. In many ways, these efforts suited Falkenhayn's strategy. Still, as de Castelnau recognized, French doctrine and national pride made abandoning Verdun unthinkable. Even so, the German offensive was already beginning to stall before Pétain's measures took full effect. Nearly 250,000 men were now caught in the struggle, and the scale of bloodshed was spiraling out of control. Our blind, wounded, crawling and shouting soldiers kept falling on top of us and died while splashing us with their blood. It was a living hell. Anyone who has not seen these fields of carnage would never be able to imagine it. When one arrives here, the shells are raining down everywhere with each step one takes. But in spite of this, it is necessary for everyone to go forward. One has to go out of one's way, not to pass over a corpse lying at the bottom of the communication trench. Further on, there are many wounded to tend. Others who are carried back on stretchers to the rear. Some are screaming, others are pleading. One sees some who don't have legs, others without any heads who have been left for several weeks on the ground. Falkenhayn made a few reserves available, and Fifth Army now rued its earlier caution in deferring the main infantry attack until the second day. As fire increased from French artillery on the left bank of the Meuse, particularly from guns near the Bois-Bureau Ridge and a hill known as Le Mort-Homme, the dead man, the Germans regretted confining their first attack to the right bank. Persuaded by the Crown Prince and von Knobelsdorff that this flanking fire must be suppressed, Falkenhayn provided more troops so that the offensive could be extended to the left bank. A major attack centered on Le Mort-Homme would be made on the 6th of March, followed quickly by a renewed push on the right bank towards Fort Vaux. The Crown Prince, for one, wanted the battle to be terminated once German casualties exceeded French losses. The hellish pattern of the Verdun fighting for months to come was firmly established in March. All German attempts to seize Le Mort-Homme failed, and each assault invariably prompted a French counterattack. Artillery fire from both sides was unrelenting. By the end of March, German casualties totaled 81,000, only 7,000 fewer than the French. At Verdun, the ones who have suffered the most are the wounded, and along with them, the stretcher bearers who transport them. Some of the bearers carry them from the front lines all the way to our post, 1.5 kilometers. Other ones take them in order to carry them off to Fleury, and having arrived there, the wounded have almost another 2 kilometers to go by stretcher before they can be transported by car. Imagine such a trip under the shells which hardly ever stop, through a landscape full of shell holes, tree trunks, and wrecked wire, through deep mud, and in certain areas through clay, where the stretcher bearers sink down all the way to their waists, being forced to call for help to get themselves out of difficulty. The Germans too realized that they needed to adjust their command structure at Verdun. General von Gallwitz was given responsibility for the left bank, and General von Mudra was entrusted with the right bank. Even with new commanders and fresh troops, April passed with Le Mort-Homme and the neighboring heights, Côte 304, still beyond their clutches. Torn between harsh determination and gnawing doubt, Falkenhayn began to wonder if a decisive blow might have to be struck elsewhere. The Crown Prince, meanwhile, was even less convinced of the wisdom of dragging the battle on. Knobelsdorff, however, felt no such hesitation. He urged Falkenhayn forward, pressing him to sustain the assault. Following an artillery barrage even heavier than that of February 21st, the Germans seized Hill 304 in early May, and by month's end had captured the entirety of Le Mort-Homme. Yet the gains came at a staggering cost. You must know that we are at the environs of Verdun, near Hill 304 and Mort-Homme. What carnage! It is horrible to see what we are seeing. We have been here now for 12 days, and every day we have serious losses. I consider myself lucky to have escaped up to now. Let's hope that it continues like this until we are relieved, which should be any day now. Because what you see every day is enough to break your heart. Moreover, we are not well, because we have all caught dysentery. You can't eat, and I assure you that we're not very strong here. In short, we hoped that we'd be lucky enough to make it back. With this heat, this stench, and all these unburied corpses and rotting flesh, we think that is what's making us ill. Despite Pétain's notable success in blunting the German advance, Joffre offered little recognition. Eager for an offensive stance and concerned that Verdun was draining troops needed for the upcoming Somme offensive, Joffre decided to shift the command structure. Pétain was moved upward to lead the Central Army Group, while Robert Nivelle was named his successor at the head of Second Army. On May 1st, Nivelle assumed direct command of operations. Alongside him came Charles Mangin, the divisional commander whose reputation earned him the grim titles the Butcher and Eater of Men, due to his unshakable faith in relentless attack regardless of casualties. Ignoring Pétain's warnings to hold back until a broader offensive could be mounted, Mangin with Joffre and Nivelle's approval, hurled his 5th Division into a brutal yet futile bid to retake Fort Douaumont on May 22nd, 23. By now, the struggle had taken on a dreadful momentum of its own, spiraling onward like a monster no longer under control. Aggressive commanders on both sides made sure the slaughter never relented. Dissatisfied with the meager gains on the right bank, Knobelsdorff secured Falkenhayn's approval for a fresh 5-division assault in the area. The operation, code-named Make-up, began on the 1st of June, aiming to capture Fort Vaux, Fort Seville, and a stronghold of the Ouvrage de Thiaumont, regarded as the last major barrier before Verdun itself. At Fort Vaux, the defenders fought with extraordinary courage, contesting every inch of the suffocating underground passages against relentless grenades, gas, and flamethrowers. We had no communication with the rear for 3 days and nights because bombardment did not let up. We were not even able to get our rations, and we only ate biscuits and chocolate. There was almost nothing to drink. Finally, we were able to get our rations, but with a lot of difficulty. Therefore, we're glad to get out of here, because we've been completely brutalized by the bombardment. One has to have a strong heart to endure such a martyrdom. This is not war. It's a massacre. Oh, when will it end? It's terrible to see what's happening. After enduring 6 days of unimaginable suffering and consumed by unbearable thirst, the exhausted garrison finally surrendered. The following day, German forces seized the Ouvrage de Thiaumont, only to lose it again by afternoon. In the months that followed, Ouvrage de Thiaumont would change hands no fewer than 14 times. Pétain's line of resistance was beginning to fray, and his frustration grew at Britain's failure to launch the Somme offensive, compounded by Nivelle's reckless expenditure of men in endless counterattacks at Verdun. General Pétain would later recall the image of French troops advancing once more into the inferno. Their expressions seemed frozen by a vision of terror. Their gait and their postures betrayed a total dejection. They sank beneath the weight of horrifying memories. They had passed through a fiery ordeal, and neither they nor the Europe they had once known were ever the same afterward. By the 12th of June, the Second Army had just one fresh brigade in reserve. The Germans were hamstrung by their own manpower problems at the critical moment. Brusilov's offensive against the Austrians on the 4th of June had forced Falkenhayn to release 3 divisions from the west for the Eastern Front. While the original aim of the Verdun offensive had long since been obscured, the cost in blood had been too high for either side to risk national dishonor by becoming the first to withdraw from the battle. I stayed 10 days next to a man who was chopped in 2. There was no way to move him. He had one leg on the parapet and the rest of his body in the trench. It stank, and I had to chew tobacco the whole time in order to endure this torment. On the 2nd of September, the French adopted a strict defensive stance at Verdun. For the German soldiers bracing for the inevitable counterattack, however, this offered little immediate relief. On the 24th of October, the French launched their assault. Ouvrage de Thiaumont and Fleury were swiftly retaken, followed by Fort Douaumont, which fell to Moroccan troops. Fort Vaux was recovered on the 2nd of November, along with much of the ground lost since February. Then, on the 15th of December, another determined push carried the French lines 2 miles beyond Douaumont, though the Germans managed to cling stubbornly to Le Mort-Homme. This final spasm of violence marked the close of Verdun's torment. French losses amounted to 377,000. German casualties reached 357,000. Neither side emerged with a meaningful advantage. Falkenhayn's failure to align his strategy with his objectives had turned his plan upon itself, draining the strength of both armies in equal measure. The Battle of Verdun ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. What remained was not conquered territory or strategic gain, but a scar on both nations. A testament to endurance, futility, and the horrific price of modern war.